That night I lay in the hospital room, connected to tubes and wires like knots of fate, my breathing no longer my own. Outside the door, I heard my son's voice, cold, distant, calculated. He spoke of my existence like a line item on a ledger. "Why keep him alive?" he said. I didn't answer, but the monitor beside me kept blinking. It echoed a rhythm that refused to let them write me off. Each beat became my silent protest. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Leonard Harper. I was 76 years old the morning I woke up to the white glare of a hospital ceiling and the low hum of machines. Before all this, I had spent my life behind a desk, buried in numbers and paper. I was a senior accountant for 38 years in a small credit union in Dayton, Ohio. I wasn't the kind of man who made noise or demanded attention. I showed up early, left late, balanced everything down to the penny, and lived a life that was neat, quiet, and predictable. There was comfort in columns and ledgers. They didn't lie, didn't shift beneath your feet. They followed rules. The same couldn't be said for my body. I'd felt it coming for years, a tightness in the chest after mowing the lawn, shortness of breath that I attributed to age, fatigue that sleep never seemed to cure. But like many men my age, I ignored it. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass, that old bones just creaked louder in winter. Then one day, it didn't pass. I collapsed in my garage while organizing screws into jars. That was the last normal thing I remembered, the clink of a metal lid and the dusty scent of motor oil. When I came to, there were wires on my chest and a monitor beside me that blinked with every beat of my heart. It looked like a strange television, broadcasting a life I no longer controlled. My mouth was dry, my skin cold, and the hospital blanket felt like plastic against my legs. I tried to lift my hand, but even that felt like a negotiation with gravity. The nurse said something when she saw my eyes open, but I couldn't understand her. Her voice floated over me like static. I wasn't afraid. I was just aware of the ceiling tiles, of the artificial light, of the sterile scent. Mostly, I was aware of the distance between my breath and my control over it. My hands, once steady from decades of balancing budgets and signing forms, trembled. I looked at them and didn't recognize them. They had grown thinner. My skin had turned almost translucent, like the plastic tubes that curled around my arms. I was no longer the man who walked to work through Ohio snowstorms, who packed his own lunch, who paid his taxes on the first of every year. I was someone else. Something else. A body pinned between beeps. I thought of my wife, Helen. She had passed 5 years earlier, in the same hospital. I remembered holding her hand when the machines around her stopped making noise. The silence after was the heaviest sound I had ever heard. And now I was the one with wires and sensors, my heart's every move displayed like a graph on a screen. It was strange to witness yourself from the outside like that, to have your existence reduced to a jagged line. The doctors called it a mild cardiac episode. I heard that term repeated, always with clipped tones and half-reassuring glances. Episode, like a chapter in a book I hadn't chosen to read. They ran tests, blood work, scans, consultations with specialists. My body had become a chart, and I, the man who once tracked other people's debts, had become a figure in someone else's report. Visitors came. Most didn't stay long. Old colleagues sent flowers. A few neighbors left cards. My son Eric showed up the second day, phone in hand, already asking about logistics. What's the plan? Rehab? Assisted living? He looked at me as though I were a calculation he was trying to solve. I saw it in his face. The math of burden, time, cost, responsibility. He didn't say it, but I could feel it in the way he stood, slightly back, arms folded, like a man waiting for a problem to resolve itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent a life fixing the messes of others, reconciling errors, adjusting balances, covering shortages. And now I was the shortage. I was the unplanned line item in someone else's life budget. The hospital food came on a tray, lukewarm and gray. The apple juice was always too sweet. The mashed potatoes didn't taste like potatoes. I ate what I could. I counted every bite, not out of appetite, but out of habit. Counting was the one thing I still had. When I wasn't sleeping, I watched the second hand on the clock. I followed its sweep, imagined it adding time back to me. It didn't. It only reminded me of how long everything took. Blood draws, pill schedules, conversations I wasn't a part of. I noticed things. The way nurses changed shifts with hushed chatter. The way the lights dimmed automatically at 9. The way some patients down the hall moaned in their sleep, while others never made a sound. I began to keep track of those too. Which voices returned each night, which ones didn't. It was easier than thinking about what came next. I wasn't afraid of death. I'd lived long enough to know its shape. What unsettled me was the way people assumed I had nothing left to say. That my presence in the world had become optional. That my body, propped up with plastic and tape, was merely waiting to be signed off. One morning, the monitor beside me beeped irregularly. Nurses rushed in. My heart had skipped a beat. Not metaphorically. Literally. The doctor adjusted my medication. They kept calling it transient. "You're stable now," they said. But I knew better. A man who had counted ledgers his whole life could tell when a system was edging toward imbalance. They brought in a physical therapist to get me moving. A young man, chipper, full of rehearsed encouragements. I did my best to cooperate. I shuffled to the window and back, leaning on a walker that smelled like disinfectant. My legs shook under me. But I made it. Twice. He wrote something on his chart. A small triumph, noted and filed away. Every evening, the cleaning woman came in, humming to herself. She didn't speak much English, but her presence was comforting. She wiped surfaces, arranged my socks, and always straightened the small photo I'd placed on the nightstand. Helen and I in front of our old house 25 years ago. I looked different then. Full, confident, whole. Now, each time I looked at that picture, I saw a man who had once believed he would age on his own terms, in his home, in his chair, with his own schedule. But here I was, lying beneath plastic tubing, with my worth evaluated by readouts and insurance coverage. Still, something inside me hadn't shut down. I felt it in my chest, beneath the wires and electrodes. A rhythm, stubborn and steady. It was the only thing I had left that was entirely mine. The machines could read it, the doctors could interpret it, but they couldn't own it. Not my son, not the hospital, not even time. So I lay still, listening to the beeps, each one a small insistence. I am here. I am here. I am here. And I wasn't ready to be written off. The days after the heart attack passed, not in hours, but in patterns. I measured time in fluorescent flickers, in the shift of light on the ceiling tiles above my bed. The ceiling had a texture like a worn sponge, dappled with yellowed spots where moisture had once seeped through. It was the only thing I could see clearly without turning my head, and so it became my sky, my window, my world. Every morning, the sun filtered through the blinds, but the light never touched my skin. It stretched long shadows across the linoleum floor and flickered off the metal edges of the medical equipment. The walls remained the same dull beige, the same chipped baseboards, the same faint hum of the ventilation system that never changed pitch. The ceiling, though, had moods. Some mornings it looked soft and forgiving, other days brittle and cruel. I stared at it until my eyes burned. I tried to recall what day it was, but memory played tricks. In the hospital, days unspooled like old tape. No sound, no sharp edges, just the blur of repetition. Breakfast, blood pressure, Pills, temperature, more pills, lunch, physical check, dinner. I began to anticipate each step, not because I wanted to, but because it gave shape to the endless waiting. I was no longer a man with plans, goals, or even choices. I was a patient, a name on a board, a room number, a meal preference checkbox. The nurse would come in, her face always covered by a mask, eyes tired but professional. She would ask me how I felt, but it was always the same exchange. I would nod. She would record. Her shoes squeaked slightly when she moved. She wore a pin on her chest in the shape of a heart. It caught the light sometimes and made a brief flare on the ceiling. That moment, when the metal flickered against the white surface, became the closest thing I had to beauty. I listened to the hospital sounds with the intensity of someone trying to remember what silence used to feel like. The distant beeping of monitors, the faint rattle of a meal cart, the occasional cough from another room. They formed a strange kind of orchestra. There was no melody, just rhythm. No crescendo, just repetition. Even the clock on the wall ticked slower, as if the air were thick with waiting. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the awareness. I could feel my body faltering, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a slow erosion. The skin on my arms looked loose. My legs, once sturdy from walking to and from work every day, now felt foreign. Even my hands betrayed me, trembling when I tried to reach for the water cup. I was present, but diminished. A man in the room, but not of it. I had become background to my own life. Sometimes, a hospital volunteer would come in with books, asking if I wanted something to read. I would decline. Not because I didn't want to read, but because I couldn't focus on words. The pages would blur. The letters would dance. The ceiling, though, that was always there. Always the same. Steady. Impartial. My mind wandered to places I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered the back porch of our old house, the way Helen would sweep it every Sunday morning, even if no leaves had fallen. I remembered the smell of burnt toast in our first apartment. I remembered the day my son was born. How small he was. How uncertain I had felt holding him for the first time. These memories came not in order, but in color and sound. The rust of the porch railing, the clink of coffee cups in the sink, the cry of a newborn echoing in a too-bright delivery room. But each time I returned to the present, it was the ceiling that greeted me. Pale, indifferent, looming. I tried to count the tiles, but I would lose track. I would start again. I tried to find patterns in the stains. One looked vaguely like a bird in flight, another like the outline of a mountain. I named them in my head, like constellations. It was a game I never told anyone about. It would have sounded like madness, but it was something. It was mine. Eric came once during that stretch of days. He stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes darting from the IV pole to the monitor. He didn't say much. I don't think he knew what to say. His visits were brief, perfunctory. I could feel him weighing things in his mind. Responsibilities, options, costs. He didn't see the ceiling. He saw obstacles. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't ready to go, but the words stayed lodged in my throat. Instead, I looked past him at the ceiling and hoped that maybe he would too, that maybe he would notice the bird or the mountain and realize that I was still there, still watching. The doctors made their rounds at noon, always the same questions, the same reassurances. You're improving. Your vitals look stable. We'll reevaluate soon. But their voices felt like messages left on an answering machine I never checked. They spoke in terms, cardiac function, oxygen saturation, that sounded like someone else's language. At night, the ceiling became darker, not from the absence of light, but from the presence of thought. My mind filled with what-ifs. What if I had gone to the doctor earlier? What if I had eaten better? What if I had reached out to someone after Helen died? instead of letting silence wrap around me like a second skin. Regret is a quiet guest. It doesn't knock. It sits beside you and waits until your breath slows, and then it begins its whispering. One night, the fire alarm in the hallway chirped. Just once, a quick beep that echoed and faded. No one came. No emergency. Just a battery running low. But the sound stayed with me. It was the first unpredictable thing in days. It reminded me that the world was still moving, even as I lay still. It made me ache. The following morning, I awoke not to light or sound, but to the deep awareness that I was, inexplicably, still here. My chest rose and fell. The monitor blinked. The world had not ended. I turned my head slightly and looked toward the window. The blinds were drawn, but a thin ribbon of light escaped at the edge and painted a golden line across the floor. I stared at it for a long time, not because it was beautiful, but because it was different. The ceiling above me had not changed. Same stains, same cracks, same lonely expanse. But something had shifted inside me. A thought, not a plan, not even a decision, but a flicker. A reminder that I had lived through another night, that my heart, stubborn as it was, had chosen to keep beating. And so I blinked up at the ceiling and whispered, not aloud, but in that quiet space inside my chest, not yet. It was sometime after midnight, though the clocks in hospitals lose all meaning when sleep comes in fits and starts. The hallway outside my room was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't invite peace, but rather underlined the loneliness. The shadows on the ceiling had shifted again, longer now, stretched across the corner where the wall met the window, as if trying to reach in. I lay awake, listening to the usual night sounds, the soft hiss of the oxygen valve, the occasional distant squeak of a gurney wheel, and the rhythmic beep of my heart monitor, steady as a metronome. Then came the voices. They weren't loud. They were hushed, deliberate, the kind of voices people use when they think someone is sleeping or too far gone to understand. But the door to my room hadn't latched properly that evening. It remained ajar by just a sliver, and in that narrow gap slipped words I was never meant to hear. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I simply listened, as if turning my head or shifting my weight might chase the voices away. The first was a doctor, the familiar cadence of professionalism in his tone. I recognized it. He had spoken to me before, in clipped, respectful summaries, how I was responding to treatment, what my blood pressure looked like, whether the medication was doing what it was supposed to. But now his voice was quieter, more cautious, as if stepping lightly across something fragile. The second voice belonged to my son. I hadn't heard Eric speak like that in years. It wasn't his usual voice, the one filled with rehearsed concern, or the crisp politeness he wore like a pressed shirt during his brief visits. This voice was low, impatient. It had an edge I hadn't heard since he was a teenager arguing about curfews or car keys. But now, that same defiance had curdled into calculation. He asked about options. He asked about timelines. He wanted clarity. He spoke in terms of logistics and outcomes, not life and breath. There was a pause, and then he said it. Why keep him alive? The words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through every part of me. I stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling I had been watching for days, suddenly colder, heavier. My body didn't flinch, but inside, everything recoiled. I had imagined many endings in my life, but never this. The cold suggestion from my only son that perhaps the numbers no longer justified my existence. I listened as the doctor replied, his tone carefully neutral. He spoke of prognosis, of potential for recovery, of decisions that might need to be made soon. My son didn't respond right away. I could almost feel him shifting on his feet, calculating in silence. I imagined his arms crossed, eyes narrowing, mind spinning through scenarios. Finances, responsibilities, Burdens. Me, the burden. The absurdity of it struck me. I had raised him with discipline and patience. I had paid for his schooling, helped him with his first down payment, co-signed loans. I had stayed up late proofreading his resumes and driven cross-state when his wife had their first child. I had done these things not because I kept score, but because I believed that's what fathers did. And now here he was, on the other side of a hospital door, weighing whether my continued breath was a worthwhile investment. I couldn't cry. My eyes remained dry, focused on the same pale tile I had stared at for days. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It wasn't even sadness. It was closer to something hollow, like the space left behind when a drawer is suddenly emptied. A new kind of silence took root, deeper than the one that filled the hospital room, a silence that wasn't about the absence of sound, but about the absence of belief. The voices faded after a while. Footsteps moved down the hall. The overhead lights dimmed to their lowest setting. The monitor next to me beeped on, unfazed, as if the conversation hadn't happened. But I had heard it, every syllable, and once heard, some things could not be unheard. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes. I watched the shadows on the ceiling dance as the HVAC system whispered warm air through the vents. I listened to the rise and fall of my own breath, shallow but steady, and I let it count out the hours in place of any clock. I thought about how many conversations had passed me by, how many quiet calculations Eric had made without my knowledge, how many decisions I was no longer part of. By dawn, I felt something different in my chest. Not pain, not the tightening that had sent me to the hospital in the first place. It was something quieter, a shift, as if my heart, after all the prodding and monitoring, had decided to speak for itself. The rhythm remained steady, but beneath that steady line pulsed a defiance I hadn't felt in years. I thought of my hands, how they used to feel on the steering wheel during long drives, how they had turned pages, signed forms, carried groceries. Now they lay still under the sheet, the skin thin, the veins raised. But they were mine. They were still mine. I was still here. Eric may have spoken of me like a cost, a line item to be managed, but the machine beside me told a different story. With every green blip and mechanical beep, it declared the same thing again and again. Alive. Not finished. Not ready. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, she adjusted the monitor and straightened my blanket. She didn't say anything unusual. She didn't know what had been said in the hallway just hours earlier. But as she leaned over me, I caught a faint reflection of the monitor screen in the chrome arm of the IV pole. The green line pulsed in slow, even waves, stronger than the night before. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But I knew then, as certainly as I had ever known anything in my life, that silence could be louder than any reply. And that line on the screen, it would speak for me. The morning after I heard my son's voice outside the door, something in me felt different. Not physically. The aches, the fatigue, the sluggish breath all remained. But something had shifted in the space between myself and the world. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, and everything that came before it now stood behind me, unreachable. I was still in the same bed, still staring at the same stains on the ceiling tiles, still surrounded by the same machines, blinking in quiet rhythm. But I was no longer the same man who had been rolled in here days ago. It was subtle at first, the way the light from the window hit the floor in a slightly new angle, the way the blanket felt heavier than usual, though I knew it hadn't changed. I became aware of every texture, the synthetic smoothness of the bed rail under my fingers, the dry crust forming on the corner of my lips, the slight tick of the monitor as if it were mimicking my heart out of obligation. The nurse came in with the breakfast tray. I didn't look at her. She didn't look at me. There was a practiced choreography to it. Check vitals, scan charts, adjust pillows. She said something about oatmeal. I nodded. I didn't eat it. The tray remained on the rolling table for hours, untouched, collecting a thin skin across the surface of the cereal. The juice was too warm. The toast had gone stiff. But I wasn't hungry. Hunger had become something abstract. I stared at the wall opposite my bed. There was a plastic board clipped to it, updated daily with names: the attending physician, the nurse on call, the physical therapist. They changed the dry erase marker ink sometimes, blue one day, green the next. Underneath the names was a space for goals. Mine said, "Get up and move." I read it a dozen times before turning away. When Eric entered the room that afternoon, I saw it. The line. It stretched between us, not visible, not physical, but undeniably there. He stood in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, as if weighing whether to come in at all. His hands were in his coat pockets. His eyes didn't meet mine. He walked in with the same casual stiffness he always had, pretending that nothing was different, that he was just there to check in, to ask the same questions, to nod at the same answers. But I saw something behind his face. An unease, a calculation unfinished. He asked how I was. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence spoke. It filled the room more than any word could. He looked at the monitor beside me, then down at the floor, then over at the untouched tray of food. His mouth moved slightly, like he was rehearsing something. But whatever it was, it never came out. Instead, he picked up the chair by the window and placed it near the bed, just outside arm's reach. That too was a choice. Another quiet message. He talked about traffic, about work, about how the weather had turned. I nodded occasionally, though I wasn't listening. My eyes were on the distance between us, on the fact that he never touched the bed rail, never leaned in, never once looked into my eyes for more than a moment. The man I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had once carried to the emergency room after he broke his wrist falling from the swing, the child I had driven across town every Saturday for piano lessons, now sat across from me like a distant relative obligated to visit. And I knew why. He had crossed the line first. Not yesterday, not even last week. The process had been slow, imperceptible, like frost crawling across a window pane. It had started when Helen passed. He had come around less often. He'd spoken less, asked fewer questions, begun answering his phone during visits, cutting them short with vague excuses. I had let it go. I had assumed it was grief, or busyness, or the weight of his own family. But now I saw it clearly. The distance wasn't accidental. It was chosen. And now, I had chosen mine. He stood to leave after 15 minutes. That was his limit, always. I knew the signs. The shift in posture, the check of his phone, the final empty phrase. He said he'd be back in a few days, that he'd call tomorrow. I knew what those words meant. They were bookmarks in a story he no longer wished to finish. I watched him walk out, his back straight, his pace steady, never once looking back. The door clicked shut behind him with a softness that felt rehearsed. After he left, I sat in the silence he had carved out. Not the silence of the hospital, but the silence of something broken that couldn't be mended. I looked at the monitor again. The green line pulsed, even and patient. I counted the beats, one by one, not for their rhythm, but for their meaning. They were mine, not his, not the doctor's, not the insurance company's, mine. I thought of the photos at home, the ones still on the mantelpiece, framed in simple wood. Helen holding Eric as a baby, me standing behind them, one hand on her shoulder. I remembered that day. It had been sunny, too bright for comfort, and Eric had been fussy, but we'd smiled anyway. Now, that image belonged to another lifetime, a version of us that no longer existed. The line between then and now was permanent. He had drawn it with words spoken behind doors, with visits calculated down to the minute, with eyes that no longer saw. And I had accepted it. I had picked up my end of the line and stretched it taut, letting the silence between us speak louder than anything I could ever say. For the rest of that day, I didn't move. I didn't call for a nurse. I didn't ask for water or pain medication. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the hallway, the shuffling of carts, the low buzz of conversations I wasn't part of. And in that stillness, I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to think. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I wasn't waiting for reconciliation or understanding or some dramatic change of heart. I had passed that point. The invisible line between father and son had become a border, and borders, once crossed with intent, rarely open again. I watched the light in the room fade slowly, the afternoon slipping into evening. No visitors came. No calls rang through. The world moved on without me, and I felt for the first time strangely free. Not from life, from expectation. The plastic mask clung to my face with an indifferent firmness, stretching across the bridge of my nose and under my chin, its edges pressing into the folds of my skin. It smelled faintly of rubber and sterilized tubing, the kind of clean that wasn't comforting, but clinical, like the inside of a new car or the lining of a raincoat. Each breath I took through it felt like borrowing, not from nature, not from the open air, but from some artificial reservoir buried deep within the walls of the hospital. I had never noticed the taste of oxygen before. Breathing, for most of my life, had been so automatic, so thoughtless, that I only paid attention when I was short of it, while shoveling snow, climbing stairs, or laughing too hard. But here every breath was magnified. The oxygen tasted metallic, tinged with something cold and impersonal, like the scent of an unused battery or the damp edge of a surgical instrument. It entered my lungs as vapor and left them heavier. I couldn't say why. Maybe because I wasn't breathing for movement anymore, not for talking or doing or being, just for staying. Each inhalation brought a slight pressure to my chest, and each exhalation seemed to disappear into the room without purpose. The mask hissed faintly with each cycle, a constant reminder that I was still tethered to machines. I hadn't stood on my own in days. I hadn't felt the weight of the earth under my feet, or the familiar ache of gravity pulling through my knees. I had forgotten what it meant to feel upright. Now, I measured strength in how long I could keep my eyes open. The nurses adjusted my flow rate that morning, and the increased stream made the back of my throat burn. I didn't complain. Complaining felt frivolous. I let them do what they needed to do. I had surrendered the idea of control the moment I arrived here. Control had shifted to screens, to charts, to people in uniforms who spoke in abbreviations and whispered over clipboards as if privacy was still a meaningful concept. Later that morning, I saw my reflection. Not in a mirror. Those were removed in most rooms like mine. But in the dark screen of a powered-down television mounted high on the wall. The glossy black surface captured a distorted image of my face. It startled me. My cheeks had sunken. My eyes looked like small bruised marbles set into a face I didn't recognize. The tubing curled across my cheeks like vines on an old fence, and the mask fogged slightly with every breath. I had become a stranger behind a shield of plastic. There was a moment, a brief flicker, when I wondered if this was what dying looked like. Not the dramatic collapse people feared, or the solemn goodbyes of Hollywood, but this slow vanishing, this quiet slide into irrelevance, into waiting rooms, into forgotten corners of sterile hallways. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even sad. I was simply aware that my presence had become observational. I watched life more than I lived it. When the respiratory therapist came in to check the machine, she spoke softly and moved with practiced ease. She adjusted the straps on my head, tightened the tubing, read the numbers off the screen. Her hands were steady, professional. but I noticed how she didn't look me in the eyes. Maybe she thought I wasn't fully there. Maybe she'd learned not to attach too closely to the ones lying so still. She left without saying much. The room felt colder after. The vent above me hummed faintly, and the light leaking through the blinds stretched across the bed like pale bands of something no longer quite alive. I stared at the ceiling again, at the familiar crack in the upper left tile, and let the oxygen fill me in rhythmic intervals. That afternoon, I tried to speak. I don't know why. Maybe to test if my voice still worked. Maybe to hear myself say something, anything, just to confirm I still had a sound to offer. But the words caught somewhere behind the mask, tangled in dryness and fatigue. All that came out was a muffled croak, as thin as a thread unraveling in air. I stopped trying. The silence was easier, more honest. I began to count my breaths, not out loud, not even in my mind, just a quiet tally kept by the weight in my chest. Each breath was a number. Each number was a confirmation. 1, 2, 3, I'm still here. 4, 5, 6, I still matter. 7, 8, 9, not yet. It became my way of existing, a new language that only I understood. The ventilator hissed, the monitor blinked, and I counted. In the stillness of the room, memories floated in and out like slow-moving clouds. I remembered the smell of Helen's hair in the early mornings, warm and clean, like linen in sunlight. I remembered the way Eric used to curl up beside me on the couch when he was small, his fingers always searching for the edge of my sleeve. I remembered the Sunday drives we used to take, no destination, just roads and the sound of the radio low in the background. I remembered laughter. I remembered light. And now, in contrast, I measured everything by absence. Breathing became ritual. It was no longer involuntary. It required intention. I had to think about it. I had to make room for it. Sometimes the mask would slip slightly, and the cold rush of unfiltered air would make me shudder. I didn't call for help. I adjusted it with weak fingers and held it in place. I wanted to do at least that for myself. Late in the day, a young intern came in. He was nervous, barely older than my grandson. He checked my chart, fiddled with the machine, asked if I was feeling any discomfort. I stared at him, unable to give the full answer I wanted to. Discomfort wasn't the word. Displacement, maybe. Dissolution. I wanted to tell him that I didn't mind the pain, that what I feared most was not being remembered as I truly was. Not the man under the mask, but the man who used to walk with a quiet confidence, who grilled burgers on July 4th, who danced once with his wife in the kitchen to a song neither of them could name. He smiled awkwardly and left. The door clicked shut behind him. The room returned to silence. I reached up and touched the tubing again. My fingers barely wrapped around it. I held it gently, like something sacred, like a line connecting me to whatever was left outside these walls. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly. The oxygen filled me, cold, metallic, borrowed, but still mine for now. Each breath was a choice, a claim, a refusal to let go just yet. And though I said nothing, though no one sat beside me to hear it, I felt the words hang in the stillness like breath on a mirror. I am still here. They brought me a small box from my house one morning. I hadn't asked for anything. I didn't know who had packed it or thought I needed it. Maybe it was Eric. Maybe it was someone from the hospital staff who thought a few personal effects might ground me in something familiar. They placed the box on the small table next to my bed and left without explanation. I stared at it for hours before opening it. It was plain, cardboard, no markings, sealed with a strip of wide tape that had started to peel at the corners. When I finally pulled the lid back, the smell hit me first. Dust, paper, faint traces of cologne, maybe something older, like the back of a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were a few things I hadn't seen in a long time. An old wallet, my reading glasses, a pen with the logo of the bank where I had worked for nearly 4 decades, and beneath those, papers, folded, worn, yellowed around the edges. My hands trembled as I reached for them. The oxygen tubing tugged slightly as I moved, reminding me to go slow. I adjusted the mask and shifted my weight against the pillows. My fingers felt stiff, like they weren't mine. I unfolded the first sheet carefully, like opening a letter from a stranger that once meant something. It was a mortgage document. My name typed in bold, next to Helen's, dated 1981, a tiny house on Sycamore Lane that we had bought with more hope than money. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, remembering the day we signed it, sitting on the cold metal chairs in the title office, Helen gripping my hand tightly the entire time. I remembered how proud I had been, how terrified. The house had been old even then. Small kitchen, drafty windows, a backyard full of weeds. But it had been ours. Beneath that was another stack. Pay stubs, tax returns, handwritten budgets on yellow legal pads. My handwriting looked steadier then, more sure of itself. Columns of numbers, neatly arranged, underlined, corrected. I used to sit at the kitchen table late into the night, making sure every cent was accounted for. We didn't have much, but we were never in debt. I kept every receipt, every confirmation number, as if the world might one day challenge my version of our lives. There was a letter I had written to Helen, but never sent. I recognized the envelope, my name on the back in pencil. Inside, folded once, was a page torn from a hotel notepad, from a business trip to Cincinnati. I had written it in the quiet of a strange room, surrounded by silence and vending machine light. It said I missed her, that I hated being away, even for 3 days, that the bed felt too wide and the air felt too still. I hadn't given it to her when I got back. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it was silly. Maybe I forgot. But she had kept it, tucked it away, and now it had found its way back to me. Toward the bottom of the box, I found the file, the one I thought I had lost, the one I had been too tired to look for in the years after Helen passed. It was an envelope marked with a single word in my writing: final. Inside were the updated versions of our will, copies of life insurance policies, bank account details, a notarized statement of medical directives. I had prepared it meticulously. I had included everything, except maybe the part that mattered most, the understanding that no document could protect you from being forgotten by the ones you raised. The will had been rewritten after Helen died. I remembered sitting with the attorney, going through it line by line, making small adjustments, removing old beneficiaries, updating account numbers. I had left the house to Eric. There was no one else, no other family, just him. And yet, even then, I had felt something unsettled in the pit of my stomach, a hesitation I couldn't name. Now I knew what it had been, a whisper from the future. I read through the clauses again, slower this time. The house, the savings, the car, though by now it had probably rusted past value. I had written it all down in good faith, believing in duty, in legacy, in the invisible thread that connects one generation to the next. But faith requires trust, and trust, once shaken, doesn't rewrite easily. I set the documents aside and closed my eyes. The oxygen hissed quietly in the background, the monitor steady. I let my hand rest on the envelope, feeling the weight of it, not in paper, but in memory. These papers weren't just records. They were the architecture of a life built deliberately, responsibly, quietly. I had never been a loud man. I didn't shout or scold. I didn't leave grand gestures behind me. I left numbers, schedules, systems, all designed to make things easier for the ones who came after me. But what happens when the ones who come after stop seeing you as part of their design. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling again. It hadn't changed. Same tile, same cracks. But I felt the distance between me and that ceiling stretch just a little further. The line between me and the world had redrawn itself. I wasn't just someone preparing for an end. I was someone waking up to the cost of his own silence. There had been too many things I had never said, not just to Helen, but to Eric, to myself. I had assumed that doing the right thing, saving, planning, protecting, would be enough, that it would translate into love, into respect. But paper cannot replace presence, and presence, once ignored, becomes its own absence. I returned everything to the box, slowly, refolding each page, smoothing each edge. I placed the file on top carefully, as if arranging something sacred. Then I closed the lid. My hands lingered there for a moment. The box sat quietly beside me, unremarkable on the outside. But inside, it held everything I had ever tried to leave behind. It was strange, realizing that a life could be reduced to records. Even stranger to feel that the records mattered more to me than to anyone else. I turned my head toward the window. A thin line of afternoon light had made its way across the floor. Dust floated in it, suspended like tiny ghosts. I had spent my life organizing other people's messes, making sense of their errors, covering their mistakes. I had always believed that if I kept things in order, the rest would follow. But now, with my breath machine fed and my name written on a chart outside a hospital door, I wondered if I had gotten it all backward. Because even the neatest box of papers couldn't fix what had already gone unloved. The window beside my bed was narrow and high, set into the wall like a forgotten thought. It didn't open. None of them did. Hospitals weren't made for fresh air. They were built to contain, to monitor, to regulate. But every morning, light found its way through that sealed pane of glass, spilling pale lines across the tile floor. It wasn't warm light. It didn't feel like sunlight used to when it poured into the kitchen at 7 a.m., baking the linoleum and warming the coffee pot. This light felt filtered, stripped of comfort, as if it had passed through something clinical before arriving, losing its color along the way. I stared at that window for hours each day. It became a marker, not of hope, but of distance. Beyond the glass, there were rooftops, bare trees, a stretch of sky that changed, but never reached me. The branches moved with the wind, but I couldn't hear them. Cars passed on a street I couldn't see. Life happened just out of view, just out of reach. That sliver of the world beyond the window reminded me daily that I was no longer part of it. I was observing, like a museum exhibit no one asked for. The glass itself was cool to the touch. I knew that because one morning I asked the nurse to help me sit up just high enough to reach it. It took everything I had. My arms shook from the strain. I leaned against the side rail, breath coming in tight puffs through the oxygen mask. I placed my fingers on the glass and let them rest there. It was colder than I expected. Not icy, but lifeless. The kind of cold that didn't melt or change. It simply existed, like the bed I lay in, like the chair in the corner that Eric never used. That touch stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone. It was a small rebellion, a secret communion with something not made of plastic or metal or cloth. I left a faint smudge on the glass, an oval from my fingertips. By the next morning, it was gone, wiped away during the night by someone doing their job, someone who didn't know they'd erased my only mark on the room. The days were gray. I couldn't tell if it was the weather or my own perception. Dulling. Time moved strangely. Hours collapsed into minutes or stretched like chewing gum, thin and tasteless. The glass never changed. It stayed clean, distant, and utterly unbothered by my presence. I started counting things again. Not just breaths, not just beeps from the monitor, but birds. Occasionally, One would land on the power line just outside the frame. A small shape, still and precise. Then, it would vanish. I wondered where it went, what it carried in its beak, whether it had a place to return to. The act of wondering gave me something to do. It became a kind of routine. Wake, listen, look, count, imagine. I thought often of the windows from my past. The wide front window of our living room, where Helen kept a row of ceramic planters with little ferns that never quite grew right. The kitchen window above the sink, where steam would collect on winter mornings as she boiled water for oatmeal. That glass had been alive with sound and scent and presence. This one was a wall pretending to be an opening. Sometimes I saw reflections in the glass. My own face, pale and gaunt, distorted slightly by the curvature of the surface. Other times, the reflection of a nurse, or the shadows of their footsteps as they passed behind me. Everything in that glass looked like it was happening to someone else, in another place, at another time. It was a mirror for ghosts. I tried once to imagine what the world outside smelled like. I closed my eyes and thought of cut grass, of gasoline, of soil after rain. I thought of my driveway, of the scent of Helen's shampoo when she opened the front door, of the cold metal of the mailbox as I opened it in December. But the memories came muffled, as if wrapped in cotton. The scent of the hospital, antiseptic, plastic, warm electronics, overpowered everything else. It settled in my throat, behind my eyes. I couldn't shake it. There was a night when the wind picked up outside. I couldn't hear it, but I could see the trees bending through the glass. Their silhouettes danced like hands reaching for something. I imagined the sound, that hollow rushing through bare branches, the rattle of twigs tapping at windows. It made me ache. I wanted the wind to break something, to shatter that perfect pain, to let the cold rush in and remind me I was alive. But the glass held. It always did. I began to dream of open windows, of sitting in my old armchair with the screen cracked an inch and the sound of evening creeping in. I'd picture myself holding a cup of black coffee, letting it grow cold as the crickets chirped. In those dreams, I was never young. I was old, just like now, but whole. I could breathe without effort. I could stand without help. I didn't speak in the dreams, but I could hear everything, and the air smelled like something real. But then I would wake to the silence of the room, the faint whir of machines, the green blip of the monitor, the thin hiss of oxygen, and the window, always the window, still in its place, still closed, still cold. I sometimes wondered if the people who designed hospitals thought about that, about how glass could feel like a punishment, about how the wrong kind of window didn't give hope, but only reminded you that the world was happening without you, that you were forgotten while the sky turned gray or blue or golden, that your breath, labored and filtered through plastic, had no place in the open air anymore. I touched the window once more before I could no longer sit up. I pressed my palm flat against it and left it there for as long as I could. It didn't return the gesture. It didn't acknowledge me. But I needed to feel something beyond the bed, beyond the tubes, beyond the slow erosion of identity. That night, I fell asleep watching the glass. There was a soft glow behind it from a street lamp below, and it made the clouds look like smoke drifting across a hidden fire. I held on to that image longer than I expected, because even cold glass, in the right light, could almost look like home. The door opened just after noon. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The pattern of steps, the pause at the threshold, the faint clearing of the throat. It was Eric. My son had always entered rooms the same way, as if testing the air before committing. Even when he was a child, he would hover in doorways, watching before joining in. It was something Helen used to say, made him thoughtful. I had always read it as hesitation. He walked in and said something. A greeting, probably. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to fill the space for him. Let him feel the room as I did. Slow, sterile, heavy. Let him notice the silence he brought in with him. He sat in the chair by the wall, not the one closest to the bed, not the one near the window where I sometimes watched the light, but the one in the corner where the line between us could remain comfortably distant. He crossed one leg over the other and pulled out his phone, glanced at it, and then placed it screen down on his thigh. That small act, screen down, was the loudest signal he gave. It was supposed to mean presence, attention, care. But it came too late. The silence between us had already settled. He asked how I was doing. I nodded. He mentioned the weather. I blinked. He commented on how the hospital food was probably awful. I let my breath escape slowly, controlled through the oxygen mask. He looked at the IV line, the heart monitor, the untouched tray of food pushed to the side of my bed. His eyes lingered on the box they'd brought from home, still sealed now, untouched since I closed it days ago. He didn't ask about it. I think he hoped I'd forgotten what was in it. There were moments when I thought he might say something real. His fingers would twitch, or he would shift in his chair, exhale sharply like someone bracing for impact. But it never came. The silence swallowed his intention before it formed. It always had. Even after Helen died, when we sat across from each other at the funeral home, surrounded by flowers and forms and tired condolences, he hadn't been able to say anything real. Just logistics, just tasks, just facts. I studied him now, in the cold light of the room. His hair was thinner than I remembered, a little more gray around the ears. His coat was expensive, navy wool, tailored, clean. He looked like a man who had things under control. And maybe he did. I had taught him to keep his life in order, to plan ahead, to protect what was his. I had spent years instilling in him the value of responsibility. But somewhere in all of that, something else had been lost. The space between doing and feeling had widened. He spoke again, something about work, a merger, a difficult client. I couldn't follow the details, not because I wasn't listening, but because the words lacked gravity. They floated above the bed, abstract and hollow. I had nothing to offer in return. He didn't expect a reply. His sentences were self-contained, as if reciting them was the requirement. He kept checking the clock without checking the clock. A glance toward the corner, a tilt of the head, the internal math of how long he needed to stay to be considered a good son. He stood once to pour a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table. His movements were careful, efficient. I watched the water catch the light as it fell into the cup. He didn't hand it to me. He placed it on the tray table and sat back down. He didn't ask if I was thirsty. I didn't reach for it. There was a rhythm to this kind of visit. The practiced cadence of small talk, the periodic glances, the way he occasionally nodded as if responding to something unsaid. But nothing was said. Not truly. He didn't ask me what I thought about the days ahead. He didn't ask how I felt when I heard what he said outside that door. He didn't ask about the house, the papers, the file marked final. Maybe he didn't want to know the answers. Maybe he thought that not asking kept the questions from existing. I wondered, as I watched him, if he remembered who I had been before this room, before the tubes and the bed and the machines. If he remembered the father who once patched his bicycle tires in the garage, who grilled chicken on the porch every Sunday, who sat beside him on the couch during thunderstorms because he was afraid of the noise. I wondered if he remembered the man who worked late so Eric could have music lessons, who never missed a single school play, who taught him how to balance a checkbook before he turned 16. Or had I become just a task, another checkbox in a busy life? The room ticked with the sound of machines. Outside the window, the sky was turning a deeper gray. He didn't notice. His eyes had drifted to his phone again, the one he had promised not to look at. I watched his thumb move slowly, unlocking the screen, scrolling through something I couldn't see. He said he had to take a quick call. He stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence rushed in louder than before. I didn't move. I didn't listen. I didn't care what was said beyond the door. I just stared at the spot where he had been sitting, the faint indentation in the cushion, the untouched glass of water now warming in the stale air. I thought of all the times I had driven him to practice, waited in parking lots, stood in crowds to cheer him on. I thought of the hours spent worrying when he came home late, the nights Helen and I stayed awake in silence after an argument with him at the dinner table, the whispered hopes we shared that he would grow into someone who cared deeply, not just about himself, but about others. And here we were. When he returned, he looked apologetic. He said something about a meeting, about having to leave soon. I nodded again. He stood, adjusted his coat, picked up his phone, hesitated. For a moment he looked like he might say something important, but instead, he just said he'd come back soon. The door closed again. I stared at it for a long time, not out of hope, but finality. That silence, his silence, my silence, the silence that stretched between us and had for years, was no longer just the absence of words. It was a decision, a quiet one, a permanent one. I felt it settle like dust in the corners of the room, in the folds of my blanket, in the spaces between heartbeats. Not everything needs to be shouted to be heard, and not every silence is empty. Some silences are louder than goodbyes. The screen beside my bed was small, square, and mercilessly consistent. It glowed faintly in the dim light of the hospital room, a quiet presence that never slept. It displayed my pulse in green, my blood pressure in white, my oxygen saturation in blue. The numbers changed, yes, but only within a tight, carefully acceptable range. They flashed, disappeared, refreshed, like a nervous whisper in a sterile room, too disciplined to scream. I had never thought much of numbers before I became one, not in this way. As an accountant, numbers were tools, things to be arranged, added, measured, and reconciled. They made sense to me. They behaved, for the most part. But now the numbers described me. They became me. I had become a formula, a data set, a stream of data meant to be watched but not touched. And the worst part was how easy it was for people to trust them more than me. Every nurse that entered the room glanced at that monitor before glancing at me. The doctors spoke of my condition by quoting those digits. Pulse steady at 72. BP slightly elevated. Oxygen holding at 95%. Not once did they say my name before citing those values. Leonard Harper didn't exist in the air anymore. Only the values did. The line on the screen didn't blink with my thoughts or my pain or my memories. It blinked with my function, the crude algorithm of survival. And still, I stared at it constantly. I memorized the intervals between the green pulses. I watched how the pressure readings fluctuated slightly after I tried to move, or after I dreamed too vividly. I learned how to anticipate the dip that came just after the morning blood draw and the brief spike that followed the nurse's footsteps when she adjusted my mask. I noticed how the heart rate nudged up a few points when Eric entered the room, though no one else seemed to care. That monitor became a mirror, not of who I was, but of how I was measured. One evening, after the nurses had dimmed the lights and drawn the curtains, I noticed a new number appear. It was smaller, set in the corner of the screen, almost an afterthought. A system check, perhaps. I watched it cycle for a few seconds, then vanish. I never saw it again, but it unsettled me. Not because it meant anything, but because it reminded me that not all the numbers were meant for me. Some were for them. Some were codes, predictions, protocols. Somewhere, someone had decided what thresholds I needed to meet to be worth saving. I began to wonder if the numbers were honest, if they told the whole truth. The machine said I was stable. The chart said I was improving, but I didn't feel stable. I didn't feel anything like improvement. I felt more distant each day, more inside myself. My hands were slower, my legs weaker, my voice barely existed, but the monitor still blinked with rhythmic precision, declaring me alive. As if being alive was simply the persistence of math. It made me think about the years I spent staring at spreadsheets, balancing accounts, identifying errors in reports that others had overlooked. I had believed, with absolute faith, that numbers told the truth. But now I saw their limitations. Numbers couldn't measure the silence of a room, the weight of being unseen, the tightness that came when you realized your son didn't look at you as a person anymore. No screen showed that. No graph rose or fell with shame. Once, during the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of the alarm on the monitor. It wasn't loud, just a subtle chime, designed more for alert than panic. I looked over. My pulse had dropped to 58. The nurse came in moments later, silenced it with a practiced tap, checked my wrist, adjusted something in the IV. She left without saying anything. The numbers reset. I lay there, wondering what had happened. Had my heart decided to rest? Had it forgotten itself? Was it a warning or just noise? The machine didn't say. It never did. It only blinked. The next morning, I watched a doctor speak to a young man across the hall. Their father had passed, I gathered. The doctor explained everything with numbers, heart rate, blood oxygen, kidney function, as if those were the final chapters in a story. I watched the young man nod, tears in his eyes, but listening still to the digits. That was how grief worked here, filtered through data, softened by decimal points. Later, when my nurse returned, I asked, or tried to, what would happen if my numbers changed? Not dangerously, just gradually. If they slipped, if they trended. She reassured me, I think, though I didn't catch all the words through the mask. She pointed to the monitor and said something about staying within range. That word, range, stuck with me, as if life were simply a matter of staying inside a box. I thought of Helen then, of her handwriting on grocery lists, of her voice singing off-key in the kitchen, of the time she told me she loved me not because I was steady, but because I noticed things, because I remembered the smallest details, the way she took her tea, the shape of her laugh. The numbers could never hold that. The monitor would never reflect that kind of memory. It could measure the beat of a heart, but never what it beat for. And yet I kept watching it, every hour, every minute. I couldn't help it. It was the only thing that changed in a room where nothing else did. When Eric didn't come, when the nurses forgot to return with more water, when my body didn't improve or worsen, the monitor still blinked, still insisted, still counted. At some point I realized I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The numbers, once ominous, had become familiar. They were a language I understood. They didn't lie, but they didn't reveal. That was up to me. And so I made a quiet decision. If this was how they were going to measure me, then I would meet them on my terms. I would keep breathing, keep blinking, keep watching. Let the monitor count. Let the staff quote figures. Let them assume. But I would remember something deeper. Because I had once lived beyond the margins of a screen. I had once held joy and sorrow and everything between, not in digits, but in hours beside a fire, in years shared across a table, in the quiet moment before sleep where you turn and find someone there. And those were the numbers that would never show up in a chart. They were mine, and no one could monitor that. The file had been sitting in the box for over a week before I opened it again. I'd looked at it the first day, skimmed the familiar pages, felt the weight of them in my hand. But then, I had tucked it away, like a photo too painful to stare at for long. Yet, it called to me. Each morning, I woke to the same ceiling tiles, the same whir of machines, the same steady hum of existence with no movement. And that envelope, thick, off-white, with my own handwriting scrawled in black ink across the top, became a thing I could still control. A piece of the world I had built with intention. The label read, "Final." I had written it in all capital letters, back when I still believed I had more time, more voice, more say. It wasn't just a will. It was everything I'd quietly organized behind the scenes over the years. A lifetime of caution, of planning, a roadmap for after. I'd assembled it like I used to assemble reports, with precision, logic, discipline. But now, that logic felt hollow, because logic doesn't speak when your voice is no longer heard. When I finally pulled the file onto my lap, my hands shook, not from weakness, though I had plenty of that, but from something deeper, from the knowledge that the contents of this file held more authority now than my own breath. I unfolded each page slowly, laying them flat across the blanket, smoothing the creases with the side of my hand. I read them again, line by line, as if reviewing a record that belonged to someone else. The first few pages were standard: durable power of attorney, advance healthcare directive, last will and testament. They had been notarized. I remembered sitting in the lawyer's office, the strange stillness of the space, the artificial plants near the window, the mechanical way the notary had stamped each form without looking up. I had gone alone. Eric had been too busy. Or maybe he had said he didn't need to be there, that I could handle it. I always had. I flipped past the boilerplate clauses and found the section that mattered. The part I had rewritten after Helen died. The part I hadn't told Eric about. I had left the house to him. That hadn't changed. I had always planned to. It was the only family home Eric had ever known. Even after he moved out, married, and started his own life, I kept the place ready. I repaired what broke, paid the taxes, mowed the lawn. I kept his childhood room untouched, not out of sentimentality, but because I believed he'd want it one day. I thought he'd bring his own children there, that it would matter to him the way it had mattered to us. But when Helen passed, I began to see things more clearly. Not with bitterness, not yet, but with a kind of sober resignation. Eric didn't call. He didn't visit. He didn't ask. He stopped saying her name. And then, one day, he asked if I'd considered selling the house. Downsizing, he called it. Said it didn't make sense for someone my age to maintain a whole property. I told him I wasn't ready, but he pressed. Asked again a month later. That's when I knew. I left the house to him. But the rest, the bank accounts, the CDs, the small investment fund Helen and I had quietly grown over the years, those I redirected. Not out of revenge, but responsibility. I had named a beneficiary Eric didn't know about, someone who had shown up after Helen died, a neighbor's son, Kevin, who used to help me carry groceries, who brought his dog to visit when he saw me sitting alone on the porch. A kid who once told me Helen reminded him of his own grandmother. I didn't tell him anything about the paperwork, but I named him anyway. Reading the words now, seeing his name printed beside account numbers and legal language, gave me a strange comfort. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the quiet relief of having left something where it might be appreciated. Helen would have understood. She had always believed in acts of grace, quiet kindnesses. She believed the way people behaved in small moments mattered more than the things they said in grand ones. I turned the page and read the clause I had added by hand, the one the lawyer had questioned, but ultimately allowed. It was short, a single paragraph. I had written it late at night, long after one of Eric's rare phone calls, the kind where he spoke only of himself, where he didn't ask how I was doing or mention Helen even once. In that moment, I'd understood something irreversible had shifted between us, so I had written it. The measure of inheritance shall not be determined by blood alone, but by presence, by compassion, and by acts unrecorded, but remembered. It wasn't enforceable. I knew that. But I had asked the attorney to leave it in anyway, as a note, as a reminder, as a truth. The monitor beside me beeped softly. I didn't look at it. I had spent too many hours watching it blink, waiting for meaning in patterns. The real meaning was here, in the papers on my lap, in the ink I had pressed into the page when my hand was still steady. I thought about what Eric would say if he ever read this, if he found out what I had done. Would he feel betrayed, angry, confused? Would he finally sit down and ask why? Or would he do what he had always done? Turn away, call it ungrateful, retreat into his own sense of entitlement? It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had done something no one could rewrite, something that carried my voice beyond silence. My body might grow weaker, my breath might fade, but these lines, these hidden lines, would outlast both. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. I sealed it with the edge of my thumb, pressing the adhesive flat. I stared at the word "final" once more, then placed the envelope under the pillow where the nurses wouldn't notice. Because someday, someone would. And when they did, they would read not just legal terms, but a father's last truth. Not loud, not vengeful, just final. There's a kind of counting that doesn't involve numbers. I used to think all things could be measured. Income, expenses, time, distance, breath. It was how I lived, how I worked, how I made sense of a world that often refused to be sensible. But what I came to understand in that hospital bed, as the hours folded in on themselves, was that some things leave their marks in silence. Not with totals, but with weight, with the dull pressure of what's missing. I began to keep a different kind of ledger, not with a pen or a spreadsheet, but in my mind, a ledger of trust, a column for what I gave, another for what was returned. It started small. I would wake in the early hours, long before anyone came to check vitals or adjust my position. I would lie there staring at the sliver of window, and in my head I'd tally things. Every favor granted, every call not made, every promise kept, every look avoided. I remembered the times I'd said yes when I should have said wait, the times I'd given when I should have asked, the moments I'd covered the gaps so no one else had to see them. Eric had always been the kind of person who assumed things would be taken care of. As a child, he never asked who paid the bills or replaced the tires on his bike. He never wondered how lights stayed on or food appeared in the fridge. And I never made him wonder. That was my mistake. Not that I provided, but that I protected him from the knowing, from the effort behind the ease. Now I watched the echo of that ignorance in his absence, in the way he called only to say he was busy, in the way he showed up out of obligation and left with his hands clean, in the way he looked past me, past the machines, past the box with the file he hadn't touched. Trust, I realized, had always been a one-way current. I extended it, expected nothing, and when it frayed, I blamed myself for the tension. I convinced myself that people were just tired, distracted, overwhelmed. But the truth was quieter. People simply revealed what they valued when they thought they no longer had to try. The nurses were kind, but transactional. The therapists were efficient, but distant. The cleaning staff moved around me as if I were part of the furniture. And Eric had become the kind of man who trusted the system more than he trusted his father. He believed what the charts said. He accepted what the doctors summarized. He read the bullet points, skimmed the summaries, asked for updates instead of understanding. He never asked me what I wanted, not once. And so the tally grew. I remembered a night when he was 12, sick with a fever, shaking with chills, and Helen was away visiting her sister. I had sat up all night with him, holding a cold cloth to his forehead, whispering stories, monitoring every rise and fall of his breath. He didn't remember it. Of course he didn't. Children forget what doesn't serve them. Parents don't have that luxury. I added it to the ledger. I thought of the summer he crashed the car. My name was on the insurance. I paid the deductible. I told him it wasn't about blame. It was about learning. I covered it. Never mentioned it again. That went on the ledger, too. And the time I watched him snap at a waitress when he thought I wasn't listening. The way he dismissed people who didn't benefit him. The cold calculation in his tone when he spoke to the doctor outside my room. Why keep him alive? Those words still circled me like vultures. Trust isn't always broken in a single moment. Sometimes it leaks, slowly, quietly. And then, one day, you realize the well is dry. You reach for something that used to be there, and your hand closes around air. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger was a luxury I had let go of. What I felt was quieter. A kind of grief that had no tears. A grief for the trust I had spent a lifetime building, only to realize I had constructed it on sand. But I wasn't without recourse. The papers I had signed, the choices I had made, the names I had written. They were more than legalities. They were corrections, not out of spite, but of balance. A rebalancing of accounts. A final audit before the ledger closed. Each time Eric visited now, I watched his face more than I listened to his words. I looked for the places where discomfort flinched behind his eyes, where guilt threatened to surface before being pressed back down. I saw how he avoided looking at the machines, how he checked his phone when the silence got too loud, how he left just before his presence began to feel like effort. The trust counter ticked again, and still, the monitor blinked. One night I dreamed I was standing in the hallway of our old home. The lights were off. The floorboards creaked. I walked room to room, touching the walls, remembering who had once lived there. Helen's scent in the sheets, Eric's laughter in the upstairs bathroom. My own footprints faded into the carpet like echoes. I opened the drawer in my nightstand and found a small notepad. On it were only numbers. No labels, no explanation, just figures, listed down the page like a silent confession. I knew immediately what they were, and I woke up with that list etched into my mind. Trust given, trust lost, trust preserved in the spaces no one saw. By then, I had stopped pretending the numbers didn't matter, not the ones on the screen, but the ones in my heart. The tally I kept was my own truth, a truth that would never be charted by any machine or spoken in any room. I may have faded from relevance in their lives. I may have become a figure on a hospital bed, a list of readings, a chart that needed updating. But I had my own record, and in that record, I had accounted for everything, quietly, precisely, completely. And in the end, there would be no discrepancy, only balance. It happened just before dawn. The hallway outside my room had been quiet for hours, the soft mechanical rhythms of the hospital undisturbed. No carts rolled by, no shoes squeaked against linoleum. Even the monitor beside my bed had settled into a slow, steady rhythm. I lay still, as I had for days, half awake in the stillness, watching the faint outline of the window begin to turn from black to charcoal. Another day was preparing to arrive, and I was still there to meet it. Barely. I felt it first, not pain exactly, but a pressure, a quiet weight behind the breastbone. Not sharp, but certain, as if something inside had finally shifted in place after weeks of imbalance. I looked toward the monitor and saw the numbers begin to change. The pulse rate dropped. Slowly, by 1 or 2 digits, then more. I didn't panic. I didn't reach for the call button. I only watched. For the first time since I had arrived in this bed, I felt like I was watching something that belonged entirely to me. The air grew heavier in the room, not in temperature, but in gravity, as if the space itself was leaning closer, listening. The machine let out a soft, sustained beep, a tone I had heard before, but only briefly. Now it lingered. A nurse would come soon. I knew the sound would pull someone toward me. But for now, it was just me and the screen. Just me and the numbers. And I understood, without explanation, that this was it. My body had become a system of readouts. My presence had been measured in waves and digits and printouts clipped to charts. For weeks they had looked at my numbers, analyzed trends, compared them to baselines. But this drop, this sound, this moment, was mine. My final report. There was no pain. There was only clarity. My breaths became shallower, shorter. Each one felt like a coin being dropped into a jar, slow and deliberate. I counted them, not with fear, but with precision. I had been an accountant all my life. Numbers were how I understood the world. I had measured growth, loss, potential. I had calculated risk and weighed decisions. And now I was measuring departure. I looked again at the monitor. The heart rate hovered in the 40s. The oxygen line dipped. The line on the screen, the one I had watched for days, began to flatten at the peaks. The rhythm changed. It lost its confidence. But it was still mine. It was still speaking. There were no flashbacks, no bright lights, just an overwhelming sense of completion. The file in the box had been sealed. The papers were in place. The letters had been written. Nothing dramatic. No final speech. No reconciliations. But everything accounted for. My life, my decisions, my silence. All tallied. All finalized. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. Not to the machines, but to the hum behind them. The almost imperceptible stillness that begins to gather before something ends. I felt my fingers, resting on the blanket, grow colder at the tips. My legs had long gone numb. My mouth was dry, but I had no urge to speak. There was nothing left that required sound. Through the small gap in the curtain, I could see the earliest light of day brushing against the hospital wall outside. That weak gray light that always came before the sun rose fully. It didn't warm the room, but it reached it. A soft, distant reminder that the world was still turning. That people were waking up, starting cars, boiling water for coffee, stretching, yawning, unaware of the moment I now lived in. I had always believed the end would come with some grand revelation, some flash of meaning or moment of understanding. But instead, it came like a ledger closing, quietly, smoothly. A final line drawn beneath a long column of figures, the sound of a drawer being pushed shut, a number, then nothing, and then a flicker. My pulse dropped again. The alarm changed pitch. It was louder now, more urgent, but still I didn't move. The sound didn't bother me. It was not a call for help. It was a confirmation, a report delivered in the only language the hospital trusted. Footsteps arrived moments later, rushed, but not frantic. I felt the presence of people around me, voices exchanged in low tones. A hand touched my wrist. Another adjusted the mask on my face. The monitor blinked faster now, catching up with what was already happening. I heard my name. Not Mr. Harper, not the patient in 314, but Leonard. One voice said it, softly. A nurse I didn't know by name, but whose presence I had come to recognize by the scent of her shampoo. She leaned close, as if willing something to remain. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't need to. I had already filed my last entry, and in that moment, I realized something the numbers could never show. I had chosen this, not the moment, but the readiness. I had decided long ago that I would not leave in fear, that I would not be dragged from this life, clutching for things already out of reach. I had made peace with what would be left behind, and what wouldn't. As the beeping flattened into a long, sustained tone, I felt not absence, but resolution. A report completed. A silence earned. I was not there to see it, but I had prepared for it. And there is a particular kind of power in that. In knowing that what must unfold will unfold without needing your presence, your voice, your hand. That everything you set into motion, quietly and without ceremony, will move forward as surely as the sunrise, as surely as the page turns after the final sentence. It began, I imagine, in a beige conference room in the lawyer's office, the one with the water-stained ceiling tiles and chairs that creaked slightly when someone shifted their weight. Eric must have walked in with that usual controlled expression, dressed in something clean and fitted, phone in hand, already clearing space in his mind for whatever inheritance would land at his feet. He would have glanced once at the receptionist, made a polite smile, then checked the time. He always hated delays. I imagined him sitting there, waiting, leg crossed, scrolling through emails with the self-assurance of a man who expected to receive, expected to be affirmed in his place. The prodigal son, returning not for forgiveness, but for the spoils. He never saw it coming. I had made sure the attorney would read the letter first, the one I had tucked into the file behind the will, handwritten on thick paper in ink that had nearly dried out my pen. A letter with no anger, no accusations, just details, facts, and the names that mattered. The line that said clearly what I had chosen and why. When the reading began, I knew Eric would sit forward, elbows on knees, jaw set. He was always bracing for something, usually disappointment cloaked as duty. But what came was something different, a quiet undoing. The legal phrasing, one clause at a time, revealing the reality he had never considered, that I had not left it all to him. The house, yes. I had promised him that long ago, and I kept that promise. But the rest, the accounts, the savings, the slow-built reserve that Helen and I had nurtured through decades of discipline and quiet restraint, that was not his. That had gone to someone else, someone who had shown up when Eric didn't, someone who had listened when no one else did, a name that, when spoken, would mean nothing to him. And yet everything. I imagined the flicker in his eyes when the realization set in, the pause, the recalculation, the questions that would rise in his throat but find no air, because there would be no space for defense, no room for rebuttal, only the echo of decisions already made, signed, witnessed, sealed. I imagined him asking perhaps if it was a mistake, if the papers had been tampered with, if someone had influenced me. But there would be no such path. The lawyer would point to the dates, the signatures, the notarizations, every line intentional, every clause reviewed, every word mine. And in that moment, the reckoning would arrive. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. There is a silence that comes not from absence, but from weight. A silence that does not beg to be filled, because it has already spoken. That was the silence I left behind. Not one of neglect, but of resolution. A silence with boundaries. A silence with structure. A silence earned by years of watching, of listening, of withholding judgment until the evidence spoke for itself. Eric would leave that office different than he arrived. Maybe he wouldn't show it. He was practiced in appearances. He would shake hands, nod, make a few cold remarks about process and paperwork. But the seed would be planted, deep. And in the quiet drive home, as the sunlight flickered through the windshield and the phone calls went unanswered, it would grow. A question would begin to take root, not about the money, but about the man he had misunderstood, the father he had measured in convenience, not character. He would remember the hospital, the way I watched him without speaking, the way I didn't ask for much, the way I let him sit in silence, thinking it was control. And he would feel it. Not guilt exactly, but exposure. That subtle burn of having been seen more clearly than he had ever allowed. Later, perhaps, he would open a drawer, find an old photo, a card, a letter never sent. He would search for evidence that he had meant more than the will reflected. But he would not find what he wanted. Because I had not written this story for his comfort. I had written it for the truth. In time, he might understand, or he might not. But that wasn't my burden anymore. I had carried the weight long enough, of patience, of hope, of silent disappointment. Now he would carry something, a stillness, a pause, a mirror. The people around him would offer their usual phrases. He did what he thought was right. Maybe there was more to the story. You never really know what people leave behind. But the truth would settle in his own body, in his own silence. A silence that would visit him in moments he did not expect, while folding laundry, while hearing a song on the radio, while seeing a father walk beside a son and not knowing why his chest ached. That was the inheritance I left. Not bitterness, not punishment, but clarity. The monitor in my room had gone still. The bed had been emptied, the papers signed and filed. But the silence remained. A silence not of death, but of finality. It was not cruel. It was deserved.